When I first took this job as an over-the-road trucker, I thought it would be full of excitement. I imagined myself traveling across the country, seeing new places, and having some crazy stories to share with my friends and family when I got back home. And well, I was not wrong about the excitement part. What I did not realize, though, is that some of these stories are better left untold. Not because I do not trust the people close to me, but because I am not sure anyone would believe me. Let me start over. My name is Jack. I am 25 years old, and I have been working with a pretty big trucking company for a few months now. I am going to keep their name out of this for obvious reasons. Ever since I finished my training and got my own truck to drive solo, I have seen some really strange things out on the road. When you are cruising down the loneliest road in America, yeah, that is actually its name, right through the middle of nowhere in Nevada, your mind starts playing tricks on you. Still, I never thought I would end up seeing something like this, something that would make me question everything. It was nearly midnight, and I still had about an hour to go before I could pull over at the next truck stop. The only thing keeping me awake was blasting the air conditioning in my face, trying to fight off the drowsiness that was creeping in. I know it sounds reckless, but you would not believe how tough this job can get until you have done it yourself. There I was, driving through the pitch-black desert on this cold summer night, when out of nowhere, something darted across the road right in front of me. I barely had time to process it before it disappeared into the bushes on the other side. Whatever it was, it moved fast, faster than any animal I had ever seen. For a split second, I thought it looked like a big white dog, but before I could really figure it out, it was gone. I tried to shake it off. Animals cross the road all the time at night. It was no big deal, I told myself. But then, not even a minute later, my truck lurched to the left, hard. I felt the whole rig veer into the other lane, and I had to fight to get it back under control. I eased on the brakes, not wanting to jackknife an 80,000-pound beast on the highway. Once I managed to slow down and steer safely to the side of the road, I knew something had hit me. I just did not know what. I pulled off to the shoulder and climbed out to check the damage. When I got around to the side of the trailer, I saw it. A huge dent, at least 5 feet wide and just as tall. There was no clear shape to it, just a massive dent that did not make any sense. My first thought was that maybe a rock had rolled down and smashed into me. But as far as I knew, I was in the middle of flat desert. There were no hills or anything like that nearby. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry desert ground behind me. My heart nearly stopped. I turned around, and standing there about 50 feet away was something. I do not even know how to begin describing it, but I will try. It was big, really big, and completely white. It had a shape kind of like a dog, but that comparison does not do it justice. This thing stood on 2 thick legs, but its front arms were long and stretched all the way past its knees. Its chest was broad and heaving, like it had just sprinted miles to get to me. The head was the worst part. It looked sort of like a wolf's head, but with a long snout full of sharp, glistening teeth, each one razor-edged and dripping with saliva. Its eyes were pure black and locked onto mine, and they were full of something terrible. Hatred, hunger, maybe both. I was frozen in place, too terrified to move. The creature stood there, blocking the way back to my truck. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I thought for sure this thing was about to tear me apart. Without really thinking, I said, "You are one ugly bastard." I do not know what I expected, but the creature did not attack. Instead, it let out a low growl, then slowly turned and crawled away on all fours, disappearing back into the desert night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to come back and finish me off. But it never did. My legs finally found the strength to move, and I ran back around to the front of my truck. I climbed in, locked the doors, and floored it. Well, as much as you can floor an 18-wheeler anyway. I drove as fast as I could down that highway, heart racing, certain that thing was going to come after me. It took about half an hour, but I finally reached the truck stop and parked for the night. I could not sleep, though. Every creak and groan from the truck made me jump, convinced that creature was lurking just outside, waiting for another chance. But nothing else happened. Somehow I made it through the night in one piece. I woke up the next morning feeling like I had barely slept. My mind was still racing from the night before, but I had a job to do, and I could not afford to sit around and dwell on whatever it was that I had seen. After grabbing a quick breakfast at the truck stop diner, I got back into the cab of my rig and hit the road again. I kept telling myself it had been a hallucination, something brought on by exhaustion and driving through the night in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to believe that, but every time I thought back to the dent in the side of my trailer, I knew something real had happened. The thing I saw had been no hallucination, no figment of my imagination. The morning drive was uneventful, but that eerie feeling from the night before stuck with me like a shadow. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, and even though the sun was shining now, it felt like the desert was still alive with strange energy. I kept glancing at the side mirrors, half expecting to see that creature running alongside me, keeping pace with my truck. But nothing appeared. By the time I pulled into my next stop, I had almost convinced myself to forget about it. Almost. I spent the rest of that day going through my usual routine, dropping off a load, picking up another, grabbing lunch, and filling up on gas. The hustle and bustle of trucker life had a way of dulling the weirdness of the night before, and I was starting to feel normal again. At least that is what I thought. That evening, I found myself heading out on another long stretch of road. The sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows across the desert. This time, I made sure to check my truck over before heading out, double-checking the tires, the engine, and even the trailer. That dent was still there, a glaring reminder of the night before. I was a few hours into the drive, well after dark, when I noticed something strange again. The highway was empty, not another vehicle in sight, just me and the desert all around. The only lights were my own headlights cutting through the night. That is when I saw it, movement in the distance just ahead of me on the road. At first I thought it was another animal, maybe a coyote or something, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. There, standing in the middle of the road, was the same creature I had seen the night before. This time, though, it was not running across the road. It was just standing there, waiting. Its black eyes locked onto me as I approached, and I felt that same wave of fear wash over me. I slowed the truck down to a crawl, not wanting to get any closer to it, but it did not move. It just stood there, staring me down. I swear, for a split second, I thought I saw it smile. That same predatory grin, full of sharp teeth gleaming in the dark. There was no way I was going to stop for it. I did not care what happened. I had to keep moving. So I did the only thing I could think of. I floored it. The engine roared as I pressed down on the gas, my truck barreling toward the creature at full speed. I expected it to run, to dive out of the way or something, but it just stood there, completely still. At the very last second, just when I thought I was going to hit it, the creature leaped straight into the air. I am talking an impossible jump. 1 second it was on the ground, the next it was soaring over my truck, disappearing into the night sky. I looked in the rearview mirror, but I could not see where it landed. It was just gone. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to pull over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. What the hell was that thing? How did it jump like that? And more importantly, why was it following me? I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down, but I could not shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching me. I checked the mirrors again and again, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but nothing appeared. Finally, I took a deep breath and forced myself back onto the road. I drove through the rest of the night without incident, but I could not relax. Every noise, every gust of wind, every shadow on the road made me jump. I was convinced that thing was going to come back, maybe this time for real. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The sun was already high in the sky, and I could hear the usual noise of other truckers moving around outside. For a moment I was relieved. It had just been a dream. But then I remembered. Dreams do not leave dents in trailers. I tried to push the nightmares aside and focus on my job, but the feeling of dread clung to me like a wet blanket. After that night, nothing felt the same. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise sharper, and the open road that I once loved now felt like an endless stretch of danger. Still, life goes on, and so does the job. I was determined not to let this thing, whatever it was, ruin my life. The next few days were thankfully quiet. I made my deliveries, picked up new loads, and traveled hundreds of miles without seeing anything out of the ordinary. It was almost enough to make me believe that maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was the stress, the exhaustion, or just the isolation getting to me. After all, long-haul truckers deal with a lot of that. The miles can blur together, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. But deep down, I knew better. I was on my way through northern Arizona when it happened again. This time it was broad daylight, and I had just finished refueling at a small truck stop. I was driving through an empty stretch of desert highway, not a single other car or truck in sight. It was just me, the road, and the vast emptiness of the desert. I had the radio on, just to break the silence, when I noticed something strange in the distance. It looked like a person standing on the side of the road, but something about it was off. As I got closer, my stomach turned. It was not a person at all. It was the creature. There it was, standing on two legs like before, its long arms hanging down at its sides, its white fur shimmering in the sunlight, its black eyes fixed on me as I approached, and that same grin stretched across its face, teeth gleaming in the sun. It was waiting for me again. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to keep calm. I had no choice but to keep driving. Slowing down or stopping was not an option, not with that thing out there. But as I got closer, something strange happened. The creature did not move, but the road ahead seemed to twist like a mirage. I blinked hard, thinking I was just tired. But when I opened my eyes again, the road was shifting, almost as if it was alive. I slammed on the brakes, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. My truck screeched to a stop, and for a moment, everything was still. The creature was still standing there, watching me, but the road, it was changing. I could see the pavement rippling, like waves on the surface of water. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. And then, just like that, it was over. The road snapped back to normal, the creature was gone, and the only sound was the hum of my engine. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. What the hell had just happened? I shook my head and kept driving, but the rest of the day felt surreal. I could not explain what I had seen, and I was not sure I wanted to. Was it real, or was my mind cracking under the pressure of this job? Either way, I knew one thing for sure. That thing was still out there, and it was watching me. That night, I parked at a rest stop just outside of Flagstaff. I was exhausted, but there was no way I was going to sleep easily. I sat in the cab of my truck, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. Every little noise made me jump, and the longer I sat there, the more paranoid I became. It was around midnight when I finally saw it again. This time, it was closer. The creature was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just at the edge of the light from the street lamps. Its black eyes gleamed in the shadows, and I could see its breath fogging up the cold night air. It was standing completely still, just watching me. My heart raced as I scrambled to lock the doors of the truck. I had already checked them earlier, but I needed to be sure. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I could call for help. But who was I going to call? The cops? What was I going to tell them? That a giant wolf-like creature was stalking me? They would think I was crazy. The creature started to move slowly at first, but then it began to pick up speed. It crossed the parking lot in long strides, moving inhumanly fast. I could hear its claws scraping against the pavement as it approached, and for a split second I thought it was going to smash right into my truck. But just as it reached the edge of the lot, it stopped. It stood there mere feet from my truck, staring up at me. Its lips curled back, revealing those horrible sharp teeth, and for a moment I thought I was done for. And then, just like before, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat in the driver's seat, eyes glued to the windows, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. By morning, I was a wreck. I knew I could not keep going like this. But what was I supposed to do? Quit my job? Tell someone? No one would believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? I needed answers. I needed to know what this thing was and why it was after me. So the next day I made a decision. I was going to find out what was going on, no matter what it took. The idea of finding out what was going on felt absurd, even as I committed to it. What was I going to do? Hunt down a creature that probably should not exist? But I knew I could not just keep running. Whatever this thing was, it had followed me across hundreds of miles. Ignoring it, pretending it was all in my head, was no longer an option. I spent the rest of that day finishing up my delivery in Flagstaff, but my mind was elsewhere. I went through the motions, dropping off the load, filling out paperwork, and picking up my next job. As soon as I had some time to myself, I pulled out my phone and started searching. I was not sure what I was looking for exactly. Maybe stories of strange creatures in the desert or other truckers who had seen things they could not explain. Something that would make me feel like I was not completely losing my mind. Surprisingly, I found more than I expected. It turns out there were plenty of stories about people encountering strange things on lonely highways, especially in the Southwest. People talked about seeing strange animals, shadows moving at the edge of the desert, and bizarre, unexplainable occurrences on roads that seemed to stretch on forever. Some of the stories felt eerily similar to my own experiences. Sightings of tall, white creatures with eyes as black as night, following travelers through the desert. One post in particular caught my attention. It was from another trucker who had seen something near the Nevada-Utah border. He described a creature that sounded almost exactly like the thing that had been stalking me. According to him, it had chased his truck for miles, always staying just at the edge of his headlights, but never quite catching up. He said it disappeared after a few hours, but like me, he had been too scared to stop. What chilled me to the bone was how he ended his post. He wrote, "That thing ain't no animal, it's something else, something older. Be careful if you ever see it. Once it knows you're there, it doesn't forget you." I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading those words over and over. Once it knows you're there, it doesn't forget you. I had no idea what that meant, but it was clear this creature was not just some stray animal. It had a purpose. After hours of searching and reading, I was more confused than ever. The stories were all over the place. Some people claimed the creature was a skinwalker, others said it was a spirit of the desert, and some thought it was something far older and darker. None of it made sense, and none of it gave me any clue as to what I should do next. By the time I hit the road again, it was late in the afternoon. I was headed east now, on my way through New Mexico, and as the sun began to set, that familiar sense of dread started creeping in again. Every mile I drove seemed to bring me closer to something. I did not know what it was, but I could feel it. The night came quickly, and soon I was back in the dark, empty world of the desert. The radio had gone silent, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the tires on the road. I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see the creature again, but the highway was empty. No cars, no signs of life, just me and the endless blackness. That is when I heard the knock. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the engine. But it was there, a steady, rhythmic tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the back of the truck. My blood ran cold. I knew what it was. There was no other explanation. That thing, whatever it was back, and it was trying to get in. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if the creature was growing impatient. It was like it knew I had no choice but to keep driving. It was taunting me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I pressed down harder on the gas, trying to outrun it, but the knocking only grew louder, more aggressive. I could hear it moving now, shifting from one side of the trailer to the other, as if it was pacing along the outside. I glanced in the side mirrors, but there was nothing there, just the empty highway behind me. And then, all at once, it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the knocking. My heart was racing, and I kept expecting it to start again at any moment. But the only sound was the roar of the engine and the wind rushing past. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was over. But deep down, I knew it was not. I drove for another hour, not daring to stop, until I saw the lights of a rest area up ahead. I pulled in, parking my truck far away from the others, and shut the engine off. For a long moment, I just sat there in the driver's seat, too scared to move, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Finally, I forced myself to climb out of the cab and check the trailer. My hands were shaking as I walked around to the back, half expecting to see the creature waiting for me, but the parking lot was empty. The trailer, however, was not. The back door was open. I had locked it earlier, I was sure of it, but now it was hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. My stomach dropped. There was no way in hell that door could have opened by itself. I had not hit anything, and the locks were solid. Someone, or something, had opened it. I grabbed a flashlight from the cab and cautiously approached the back of the trailer. My heart was pounding in my ears as I shone the light inside, but the trailer was empty. Nothing. No sign of damage, no sign of anything, except for a single set of claw marks etched into the metal floor. Long, deep scratches like something had dragged its claws along the surface as it moved. I staggered back, my breath coming in short gasps. It had been inside my trailer. Whatever that thing was, it had been in there with me, following me for God knows how many miles. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I had no idea how it had gotten in, or why it had not attacked me. But one thing was certain, this was not over. Not by a long shot. I did not sleep that night, just sat in the cab of my truck, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. I could not shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching me, waiting for its next move. Every time the wind rustled the bushes or a car drove by in the distance, my heart leapt into my throat. I felt like I was being hunted, like a rabbit frozen in the tall grass, praying the wolf would pass by without noticing. By morning, I was completely exhausted, but I knew I had to keep moving. I could not stay in that rest area, and I was not about to go poking around the desert looking for trouble. I started up the truck and got back on the road, forcing myself to focus on the drive ahead. I had a job to do, and if I could just keep my head down and finish this run, maybe I could figure out a way to deal with this nightmare later. The miles dragged on, and with every passing hour, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. It was like the air itself was charged with something dark and malevolent, pressing down on me with each passing minute. I could not escape it, no matter how fast I drove or how many hours I put between me and that rest stop. The creature had followed me for days, and I knew deep down that it was not going to stop now. As I passed through a small town in New Mexico, I noticed a sign for a local diner off the highway. My stomach rumbled, and I realized I had not eaten since the previous morning. Against my better judgment, I decided to stop. I needed a break, if only to clear my head and get something in my system before the next leg of the journey. The diner was small and run down, but it looked like it had been around for decades. I parked my truck in the lot and stepped inside, greeted by the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee. A few locals were scattered around the booths, chatting quietly over their breakfasts, and the waitress gave me a tired smile as she led me to a booth near the back. I ordered a cup of coffee and some eggs, trying to shake the exhaustion that had settled deep in my bones. As I waited for my food, I found myself scanning the room, watching the other diners out of the corner of my eye. Paranoia had set in, and I was convinced that at any moment, the creature would burst through the door or appear at the window, its black eyes boring into me. But nothing happened. The waitress returned with my coffee, and I took a long sip, letting the warmth wash over me. For the first time in days, I felt a small sense of normalcy. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the creature was gone, and this was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. After finishing my meal, I headed back to the truck, the sun hanging low in the sky as the afternoon slipped into evening. I still had several hours of driving ahead of me, and I needed to find a place to sleep for the night. The thought of pulling into another rest stop filled me with dread, but there was no avoiding it. I drove for another hour before finally spotting a rest area on the horizon. It was a small, isolated stop, nothing but a few picnic tables and some bathrooms. It felt desolate, but I had no choice. I pulled in, parking my truck far from the other few cars that were parked there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the familiar unease began to settle over me. I could feel it in my bones, that same sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I locked the doors of the truck, double-checking them just to be sure, and tried to get some sleep. But sleep would not come. Hours passed, and I just lay there wide awake, staring up at the ceiling of the cab. Every little noise outside made my heart race. Every gust of wind had me on edge. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. The knock. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it was there. A gentle tapping at the back of the trailer, just like before. My blood ran cold, and I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the blanket. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I knew what was coming, but there was nothing I could do. I was trapped in this steel box, helpless against whatever was out there. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if the creature was getting impatient. I could hear it now, moving around the truck, scratching at the sides, tapping on the windows. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I reached for my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I dialed the number for the local police, not even sure what I was going to say. What was I supposed to tell them? That some kind of monster was trying to break into my truck? But before I could hit the call button, the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat there frozen, waiting for something to happen. And then, just like that, the cab of the truck started to shake. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor, but then it grew more violent. The entire truck was rocking back and forth, as if something was slamming into it from the outside. I could hear the metal groaning under the pressure, the windows rattling in their frames. My heart was in my throat, and I knew there was no way I could stay in the truck. I had to get out. I had to run. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and threw it open, jumping down onto the pavement. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and I stumbled back, barely able to stay on my feet. I looked around frantically, expecting to see the creature standing there. But the parking lot was empty. There was nothing there. Just my truck, still rocking slightly in the darkness. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I heard it, a low growl coming from behind the truck. The growl was deep and guttural, vibrating through the air like the rumble of distant thunder. My heart nearly stopped as I slowly turned, expecting to see that terrifying white creature, the one that had been following me for what felt like an eternity. But when I saw it, I realized this thing was even worse. It was taller than I remembered, at least 7 feet, maybe more, with that same hulking, muscular frame. Its fur was matted and filthy, white streaked with patches of mud and dried blood. Its head, long and narrow like a wolf's, was turned toward me. Those black, soulless eyes staring into mine with an intensity that chilled me to the core. But this time there was no hesitation, no waiting. This thing was ready. I backed up, my feet shuffling across the cold pavement, trying to get as much distance between me and the creature as possible. My mind raced for an escape plan, but there was nowhere to go. The open desert surrounded us, miles of empty land with no sign of help. My truck stood between me and the highway, but even that felt like a death trap now, rocking on its wheels like a toy. The creature took a step forward, its massive paws crunching on the gravel beneath it. I could see its breath in the cold night air, steaming from its open maw, which was lined with those razor-sharp teeth. Every step it took made my heart pound harder, and I was almost paralyzed with fear. But I forced myself to move, turning and running toward the other side of the truck, hoping to put some distance between us. I darted around the front of the truck, my legs burning with effort as I sprinted across the lot. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the pavement. It was fast, far too fast for something its size, and I knew there was no way I could outrun it. Panic surged through me, and for a split second, I considered trying to hide inside one of the nearby bathrooms. But then I saw it, a glimpse of movement in the shadows ahead, something darting between the trees lining the far edge of the rest area. Was there more than one of them? I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gas as the reality of the situation sank in. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. These things, whatever they were, had me surrounded. The first creature rounded the corner of my truck, its eyes locked onto me with a predatory gaze. It let out another low growl, the sound vibrating through my chest. My instincts screamed at me to keep running, But there was no point. I was trapped. Just as I braced myself for the inevitable, a blinding light flooded the parking lot. Headlights. A car was pulling in, tires screeching on the pavement as it skidded to a stop. For a moment I thought it might be my salvation, a lucky break that would scare the creature away. But when the door of the car opened and a man stepped out, I felt my stomach drop. He was tall, wearing a long coat and wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. He moved with a deliberate slowness, almost too calm given the situation. I could not see his face clearly, but something about him set off alarm bells in my mind. This was not a random passerby. He was here for a reason. The creature did not back down. It snarled, its eyes flicking toward the man for a brief second before returning to me. I stood frozen between them, unsure of what to do. The man stopped a few feet away, his face still hidden in shadow, and then he spoke. "You shouldn't have run." His voice was deep, calm, and almost soothing in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. The creature was still pacing, its body tensed and ready to strike, but it seemed to be waiting for a command from this man. What do you want?" I finally managed to croak out, my voice barely a whisper. The man chuckled softly. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you've seen, what you've attracted." He gestured toward the creature, which had stopped moving and now stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on mine. "You're marked," the man continued. "These things, they don't forget someone like you. Once they found you, there's no running, no hiding. They'll follow you to the ends of the earth." I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. "What are you talking about? What is this thing?" The man sighed as if he was explaining something obvious to a child. "It's not something you can understand. Not fully. It's older than anything you can imagine. Older than the land itself. It's hungry, and it's been waiting a long time for someone like you." My heart raced as his words sunk in. Someone like me? What did that even mean? I wanted to ask him more, to demand answers, but before I could, the creature lunged. It moved so fast I barely had time to react. One moment it was standing there. The next it was on me, its claws sinking into my shoulders as it slammed me to the ground. Pain shot through my body as its weight pinned me to the pavement, its foul breath hot on my face. I screamed, thrashing against its grip, but it was no use. This thing was impossibly strong. The man did not move. He just stood there watching, as if this was exactly what he had expected to happen. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice hoarse with terror. "Please, make it stop!" The creature's snarling jaws hovered inches from my throat, and I could feel its hot saliva dripping onto my skin. Every muscle in my body was screaming in pain, and I was sure I was about to die. But just as the creature seemed ready to rip me apart, the man spoke again. "That's enough." The creature froze. Its jaws closed with an audible snap, and it slowly released its grip on me, stepping back as if nothing had happened. I lay there on the ground, gasping for breath, too terrified to move. The man knelt down beside me, his face still hidden in shadow. "You're not going to die, not tonight anyway." He reached out, placing a hand on my chest. "But you need to understand, this thing will never stop hunting you. You can try to run, but it will always find you." I wanted to scream, to push him away, but I was too weak. His words echoed in my mind, a grim reminder that this nightmare was far from over. He stood up, and the creature followed him, slinking back into the shadows as silently as it had come. I was left lying on the cold pavement, the weight of his warning pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket.